Hello and welcome to the latest session from the Cyber Conference. Today's session is the threat from within, insider threats and commercial espionage. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Robert Capper. I'm the head of the commercial team at Paris Supply Rickaby's, and I'm chairing the session today. I'm delighted to be joined by a number of speakers from around the globe. I'm joined by Dave Harvey, who's the Managing Director of FTI Consulting, and a few words about them in a moment. I'm also joined from FTI by Ian Smith, who's their Managing Director and based in their London office, and then Tim D'Souza from New York, and Rosemary Gigante from New Zealand. They're all speaking today. FTI are an independent global business, an advisory business advising on managing, mitigating and resolving disputes around cyber security breaches in particular, which puts them in the ideal place to present today on a whole range of issues coming out of cyber breaches, and in particular insider cyber breaches, because actually cyber breaches are just as devastating from within organizations as they are from outside. And today's focus is very much on that risk from inside. So we're going to talk about some of the issues from whether it be a cyber attack from within or a data breach from within. But Dave, Ian, Tim and Rosemary are well placed to walk us through those issues today. We've got a running order of about an hour and a half speaking time, followed by a Q&A. And in the best style of the leading pilots, when you're joining a flight, to be told, we hope to get you to your destination within time. We very much hope to have this morning's session completed in time to give time for everybody to ask any questions that they may have. And I already have some questions to ask the team that are assembled to talk to you today. If we can move on to the first slide, and we can just look at the objectives of the session. With the session running, as I say, for around about an hour and a half, I think it's important that we do understand what we're going to talk about. Hopefully, those bullets there are all self-explanatory, but obviously, we'll just quickly run through them. We'll look at why employees might be driven to actually steal data, why the internal threat is increasing, what steps you can take to protect yourself, and how then to investigate the threat and what to do if it happens to you. And hopefully across those 5 objectives, we can give you everything that you need to know going forward, both to protect yourself from any of these challenges, but also to deal with them if they should come up. So I'm sure as much as you'd love to hear more from me, actually you'd much rather hear from our speakers today, because that's after all what you've signed up and have joined on to listen to. So we'll start then with a short presentation from Dave on what are some of the current trends. And we'll move on from that then to Dave and Ian looking at some of the examples. And then Ian and Dave then will look at some of the differences between insider and external threats, followed then by Tim and Dave looking at some of the indicators for threats and why they're increasing. Rosemary will then pick up on the impacts of COVID, and I think some really interesting questions there that come out of that particular session with Rosemary about the impact of COVID on cyber attacks, how to manage your insider threats as well. Rosemary will cover off before we move back to Tim, looking at information governance, and then back to Rosemary, then looking at some of the lessons that companies can benefit from, before finishing off with Dave, and I suspect possibly Ian as well, looking at what you need to do to get started to protect yourself from these issues. Then at that stage, then it's back to me to chair the Q&A. So let's get started. Without further ado, Dave, over to you.
Many thanks, Robert, and good morning, everybody. So the cybersecurity threat is both high profile, exponentially evolving, and what we're seeing is that human factors in cybersecurity continue to represent some of the most significant threats. and none more so than that posed by insiders. Now, you may have heard the phrase humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity. I would strongly disagree with that, because from our point of view, we would like to consider cybersecurity holistically across people, process, and technology. Each should be mutually reinforcing. So a key takeaway that we're going to introduce you to is that rather than consider your workforce as the weakest link, consider them your first line of defense. So to begin with, let's look at how we could possibly define the insider threat. Slide, please. And again. So over the last 18 months, I'd suggest that this definition has potentially taken on a new nuance. Traditionally, we've seen maybe a fortress mentality to cybersecurity, where the best form of protection is the building of bigger, stronger, higher walls to keep people out. Now, following the transformation and to a remote workforce, this concept, or indeed the very concept of trying to define a perimeter of an organization, has changed. Another way, therefore, to look at this is rather than define as an insider as somebody within your organization, is to maybe look at what sort of access they have. As such, you could look at a definition of an insider being a trusted individual with legitimate access to sensitive information stored and processed by your organization. And therefore, that insider threat being realized when a trusted individual contravenes security policies set up to protect said information. Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, we often refer to the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Insider attacks can impact each of those, and later we're going to demonstrate to you some cases where that is indeed true. Now, this definition can be broad enough to cover both malicious action and what you can maybe consider negligent or unintentional. An interesting statistic is that more than 2 out of every 3 insider attacks or incidents are caused by negligence. So looking at this particular slide and the types of insider threat we can see, we've got 3 examples. And this demonstrates at a very high level some of the internal and external factors. However, where this gets really interesting is where these start to overlap and blend. And we're going to talk about some examples of that again later on. Now, some things to take away. Exfiltration of data often goes undetected far longer than other cybercrimes. It can be a slow trickle, but as we're going to discuss, an insider understands exactly what an organization's most sensitive data is and where it's stored. So this makes the impact of each exfiltration potentially far more significant. Visibility of user activity is often poor and compounded by data privacy issues. And these data privacy concerns are a topic that Rosemary is going to explore later on. It's difficult to understand some of the contributing external factors that influence an insider threat, and therefore understanding that sort of human factor element can become paramount. Now, an example that we often see is the dynamic nature of the insider threat as part of something like a merger and acquisition. So at each stage of the process, the most significant threat can change. When a deal becomes public, often the highest threat may be external, as attackers may sense a moment of weakness as attention's diverted. At other points, the threat could be primarily internal, such as if an IT or a security team may feel threatened in terms of their own job security. So being aware of this changing threat nature, being able to monitor activity and taking proactive protective measures is therefore really important. Employees have increased the opportunity to access sensitive data remotely over the last 18 months especially. And also that's developed an ability to sidestep many of the breach alerting mechanisms that may have been in place beforehand. Now, one of the more interesting elements about this is that an insider incident doesn't necessarily mean that data has been exfiltrated. It could be a phone call, or another slightly different example would be harassment campaigns that are instigated by insiders or maybe recent employees. Remember that those insiders have the organizational structures and knowledge that ensure that harassment campaigns can be particularly targeted. So what are the motivations for the insider threat? Well, Financial, there's clearly monetary gain that they could see. There's ideological. They may see a particular personal gain to their own ideology for actually acting against the organization they're working for. They could be manipulated or coerced by an outside actor. It could be revenge. They may feel they've been slighted by the company, and therefore there's an opportunity for them to take revenge against them. Or it could be a lack of awareness or training. Negligent insiders are just your average employees who've made a mistake. For example, they could send an email to the wrong person or click on a phishing email, for example. So, well, why should organizations care about this? First of all, it's the scale of the potential damage. The damage caused by a single insider with broad access can be severe or even catastrophic to an organization. Aside from the large regulatory fines from loss of customer data, business operations and reputation all can be affected to the point that an organization fails. And it could undermine other sort of IT or security investment. You know, insiders can undermine or bypass even the most technically protected networks, nullifying the investment in other aspects of cybersecurity. Many external cyber attacks are quickly identified and can be stopped and damage managed, but a well-placed insider can operate for years without detection. Finally, there's maybe a greater reputational impact, but more opportunity to prevent. Any loss of data or damage from an incident is a bad day for an organization, but the impacts are magnified once revealed that a trusted member of the organization was responsible. However, most insider threats develop over time rather than just being present in new hires. So there's multiple opportunities to identify and prevent the risk from resulting in a breach. Slide, please. And again. So looking at the current trends, breaches are increasing in frequency, increasing in impact, getting a lot of media attention. And the FTI Resilience Barometer in February of this year, we looked at G20 companies experienced more data breaches in 2020 than they did in 2019. No real surprise there. We routinely see breaches involve hundreds of millions. We're seeing more data leaks and more ransomware. We'll come on to that later. Now, effectively, the COVID edition of our Resilience Barometer reported around 60% of G20 companies are expecting heightened threat from insiders, with the average global cost of an insider threat reaching about $11.45 million. Research before COVID-19 showed about 80% of insider threats developed during employment. Many of those risk factors for such cases are greater due to enforced remote working. In thinking about how to manage these, clients are wanting to take a more considered, holistic approach to the issue alongside other elements of their cybersecurity. Another element that's maybe closely related to that hybrid or remote working is the increase of bring your own devices. And this presents a raft of very different challenges, especially around monitoring, around protection and privacy, which Rosemary is going to discuss. We're seeing an increase in fraud detection across the board. Some of that fraud is procurement fraud or other forms of compromising sensitive or commercial data. Much of the fraud is pre-existing and is being noticed only because of the change of the work environment. Theft of intellectual property in manufacturing and pharmaceutical industries. A particular example that we've been involved in is a large number of due diligence activities, especially in the fintech space, where there's concerns about developers considering their own work as their own IP, and therefore they're copying chunks of code between employment. Now, being able to understand those code dependencies is therefore important. Ian, I know that you've been involved in a lot of those sort of IP investigations. Would you have another example?
Yeah, and I think a trend we see as well is that feeling of employees that they have an entitlement to data and, as you mentioned there, but also something that is quite common is contact book. So senior managers, executives in companies, they build their network, they make contacts, and when they move from one company to another, they want to take them with them. And despite being aware of company policies, they have a different view to that type of information as to what they would think of maybe the company's IP. So there is a trend there, a blurring of the lines between what is clearly IP versus what someone actually has a right to take with them.
Thanks, Ian. Another trend that we're seeing is the theft of financial, workforce and employee information. With COVID-19, we're seeing that some companies and even employees are impacted. Therefore, individuals are more likely to be enticed to leverage their data and access to the data to gain a profit. We were recently involved in a case whereby an individual working in a call center was coerced into extracting customer details. Our task as investigators was therefore to analyze logs and ephemeral data like instant messaging or chat feeds to understand exactly what's been exfiltrated. And this was critical to allow the client and their counsel to then report back to the regulator and the risk. Just to reconsider that scenario slightly, an employee in a call center can have access to vast amounts of customers and their data, and therefore there should be robust protections in place. Ian, was there anything else to note in that particular subject?
It's a very interesting point and example. So in my previous life, I worked at Special Compliance Office in the Digital Forensics Group. And one of the areas of concern was obviously loss of data with relatively junior staff having access to incredible amounts of individuals' data, not least tax records. And as you might expect in a government agency, the training was very clear. It was very regular. So there was no question there. And in fact, the technical measures were quite thorough, to the extent where for certain systems, there would actually be a recording, a capture of every screen that an individual would look at. So a complete record of everything they did online. However, the challenge there is detecting it. If somebody accesses the Prime Minister's tax records, that will very quickly trigger an alert and be looked at. But for most of us, well, we're not high profile enough that that would happen. So the question is, despite all of the measures, how do you detect activity of an illicit nature in the huge daily volume of activity that in many ways is very, very similar, that is not illicit?
Thanks, Ian. And so one of the things to take away from that is the impact of an organization can be extreme. Each incident costs companies time, money, and resource to repair, while inflicting often irreparable damage to brand reputation, customer loyalty, and even risk fines. Ian, one of the threats I would suggest is maybe an employee maybe falsifying, amending, or deleting a record for whatever reason. This clearly an attack against the integrity or potentially even the availability of a key piece of data. Would you have any sort of examples of that?
Yes, and that's all too common. And one example is a matter we worked on. This was with a global manufacturer, and they were actually undergoing an investigation in relation to FCPA violations. And what we found partway through the investigation was that it appeared one of the key employees appears to have been deleting large volumes of email data. Now, this is known as spoliation and is treated very serious. That actually resulted in in potential criminal liability. So we performed quite a broad investigation into the activity, the potential deletion activity, the gaps that were left in the data record, the chronology of events, and pieced together a picture so that we could try and ascertain whether it was intentional and what the potential harm was, bringing together a lot of fragmentary evidence to try and build up that picture. And we reported our findings to the SEC and the DOJ. And this is an action by an individual that can have a very serious impact on that individual. But in that context, the repercussions for the company that did not prevent that spoliation activity were potentially very, very severe. In that particular case, the evidence did suggest that there was intentional actions there, and that was taken into account in quite serious fines and other action that was taken against that company. So the actions of a rogue employee can have very serious knock-on effects when they're allowed to take place undetected.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and I think there's another very high-profile US case. It's more to do with IP theft, and it related to an engineering firm. So an employee departed in about 2013 to set up his own consultancy. And during the 2 years after his departure, he hacked his former employee's file server repeatedly, downloaded schematics, staff emails, budget, marketing documents. And according to court documents, this individual accessed the email account of a former colleague, and he used it to download materials. So as part of the investigation, the IP address used to illegally access the inbox was logged and traced back to his home network connection. Now, this individual had also gained access to and downloaded more than, I think it was about 100 PDF documents, about 80 odd AutoCAD files containing schematics, job bids, and other proprietary information. So even though passwords were changed routinely on the servers, this individual was still able to gain access. His business partner in the consultancy was aware of this, and he urged him to stop. Now, the intrusion was eventually uncovered when a client of his previous employer reported receiving an unsolicited business proposal that nearly matched the language word for word used in a very similar pitch from the engineering and design business. The FBI was called in, and the computer intrusion discovered. In April 2017, the individual pleaded guilty to one count of intentionally accessing a computer network without authorization and agreed to forfeit his engineering license. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 2 years supervised release, and instructed to pay over $170K to his former employer. Slide, please. Now, as you'd expect, a company like FTI is involved regularly in phishing incidents that have led to ransomware or payment redirection attempts. On ransomware, we've seen a huge increase. And we've also seen an increase in what we'd refer to as maybe double or triple extortion. So double extortion is not only when your enterprise is encrypted, but also that the threat actors removed some data. They've taken that data, and therefore you're being held to ransom for not only the decryption keys for the network, but also the threat of releasing this data into the dark web. Triple extortion is where the threat actor maybe tries additional leverage. So they could take out social media ads against the company, they might contact customers, or they even may message board members directly. Slide, please. Now, another very, very recent example that was highlighted in the news this week was of a Pakistani man who bribed employees in a major US telco to install malware in the company's internal network. And he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Now, he illegally unlocked more than 1.9 million phones, causing this particular US telco losses in excess of $201 million. This individual paid more than $1 million in bribes to employees during the sort of the mid-2010s to install this malware. That's a great example of an external threat coercing internal users to facilitate this large-scale fraud and impacting the organization in a really significant way. A similar case study we were involved in involved a harassment campaign over in the Middle East, and that involved a number of insiders. So this Middle Eastern firm was receiving anonymous emails targeting HR and a general manager. These emails were quite slanderous and certainly very hurtful against some individuals. And from the company's perspective, some of them needed due diligence in order to disprove. Now, this was bordering on illegal activity and requiring law enforcement, but we were involved in order to correlate email traffic, SMS and phone call activity and conduct a level of open source intelligence gathering to provide a level of confidence about attribution. And we determined 2 individuals were involved. These personnel were subsequently released by the company and the harassment campaign ceased. Ian, would you have any other examples?
Yes, I mean, sadly, we have many examples. I'll just raise a couple. I think they illustrate interesting points. So, in one case, we assisted with. It was actually a fund management company where one of their employees was stealing their IP, but not in the form of, say, taking blueprints to a device or a copy of a document. It was the approach to certain trading. So it was a lot broader, and what they had done was effectively distill and pass the strategy off as their own ideas to leverage a position in a competitor. The company, obviously, in the business they were in, had quite good measures in place, but it was only by accident, actually, that they finally detected that this was going on when the individual made a mistake and printed something that triggered one of their warning systems. At that point, they brought in their external counsel and they contacted us. And we attended the initial conversation with that individual where they were confronted with their activity. And there's an obvious benefit in having external counsel in a situation like that, and in respect to FTI from a technical point of view, the benefits there were that we were able to ensure that the appropriate technical questions were asked to understand the depth of what this person might have done in terms of dissemination of this information, and uncover stones and traces, because one of the most important things in this type of case is protection and remediation. Once the problem has manifested itself, it's very important to try and limit it and roll it back. So the upshot of this was ultimately an investigation took place that uncovered what the person had done. The company that he had leveraged this company's information to was effectively an innocent party, but contaminated by information from this individual. So we assisted in 2 different areas. One was remediating this information that was on the individual's systems, which can be challenging because we're talking about an individual's personal systems where they maintain some rights, but more interestingly, on the systems of the company that he took this information to. And again, the challenge here is not that we were simply looking for a particular document, it's that we were looking for information in relation to a trading strategy and derivative works thereof, which you can imagine is not straightforward to actually detect and ensure is cleaned from places it should not be, to the satisfaction of all parties. So I think that's another side of this that is worth everybody bearing in mind, that it isn't just about prevention and detection. You cannot be 100% in those areas. So there is the cleanup and remediation aspect on the other side. Another that I'll touch on is in relation to internal fraud. So this is where an individual inside a company was using their privileged position as someone who received invoices via email and electronically, that would then be passed on, go through a certain number of processes and checks, and then be paid. What they were doing was actually manipulating the invoices and the emails so that funds would get diverted, and then passing them on internally. Now, an interesting aspect to that is one of the measures that can be done to try and give some protection and to assist in dealing with this type of activity. So there was some suspicion. Unfortunately, the company had turned on their legal hold facility email, which most email systems have. And what that does is make sure that all email is returned. Now, the person was tampering with email, and it didn't prevent that. So it didn't prevent the person from conducting a fraud. But what it did do is ensure that in addition to the tampered email, there was retained an original genuine copy. So what that enabled us to do in the investigation is, on the one hand, find these tampered emails by using some of our technology, but also then performing a comparison against the original, which provided extremely good evidence as to exactly what had happened.
Thanks, Ian. What about yourself, Tim? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. There are a couple of examples I can think of. We worked on a matter recently where a client came to us. They were an online retail site, and their chief technology officer was just on the way out. He had found a new role. He was departing amicably from the company and was currently working with them in a consulting role just to help the new CTO, the incoming CTO, settle into the company. They found that somebody had logged into their environment and just left a couple of time bombs in the code that were getting progressively worse and would eventually have taken down the website during their busiest trading hours on the weekend. And they started looking into it, and they traced it back to this outgoing CTO. So they'd come to us for assistance on a code review to help identify any other traps that he had laid. And eventually they ended up having to restore the entire website from backup. But they just couldn't figure it out. They thought this guy was leaving amicably. They didn't understand what motivation he had to try and take down the site. So they called him. And he said, "Oh, I don't actually remember doing that, but I did get pretty drunk and took a couple of other substances the other night. And well, I do this every time I leave a company, so it was probably me." And that's a bizarre story, but I like it because it underlines that there isn't necessarily a good motivation. Sometimes people just do things to watch the world burn. Another more kind of mundane one is a phishing matter that we worked on recently that I thought this was a matter that we worked on late last year involving an Australian state government agency. But I think before I get into the details of it, Dave might want to talk about phishing more generally and the kinds of threats that we see using phishing techniques.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's a great example in terms of somebody with that privileged access that's able to do something that is completely unexpected and very difficult to predict. Now, in this particular example, we've been looking previously about some of the definitions of internal and external threats and how they could potentially overlap. And here's a great example. We're looking at a phishing attack. Now, there are a variety of different types of phishing attacks, including invoice phishing, payment or delivery scams, tax-themed phishing scams, or as we've seen recently, COVID-related. So things like getting a text looking at a new booking for vaccinations is a great example. We've seen downloads. So a user maybe clicks on a link, redirects them to a site, and unaware to them, it downloads malware to their device. It could be spear phishing, where it's a bit more targeted, and then whaling, where you're going after the really big fish, that sort of high-profile individual or some of those key positions within a firm. Now, once an actor has access to your system, it presents them a range of options. You know, they could just sit quietly and watch what you're doing. They could explore your network. They could exfiltrate some IP, sensitive documents, or personal data. They could launch a ransomware attack. They could maybe implant malware or change code, as per Tim's example. And this supply chain type of attacks gained an awful lot of media interest this year. But the one that we're going to really discuss today is to do with business email compromise leading to something like a payment redirection attack. Back to yourself, Tim.
Thanks, Dave. So this is a case in which an Australian state government agency noticed some strange emails coming from one of their finance managers. They suspected an intrusion, so they just shut down their system and they activated their breach response plan. And they called us in to assist. So what had happened here was that a fraudster had compromised the credentials of a senior executive with a spearfish email. And then they used that executive's email to start launching multiple waves of phishing campaigns inside of the client's network. What they were doing was trying to leapfrog their way into a useful account. Every time they found one, they would set up a set of email forwarding rules that they would conceal from the user and just send themselves emails that they thought were going to be useful to them in perpetuating the scam. Eventually, they found their way into the email account of a member of the finance team, and that's when they started the actual exploit, which was trying to impersonate the finance manager. So they took their time. They spent some time figuring out what the payment run was like, how often it occurred, what kinds of suppliers this institution was paying. And then they started in a very targeted way, impersonating that finance manager. Trying to get other members of the finance team to change payment details just before the bi-weekly billing run. In this particular instance, they kept up the impersonation for a couple of weeks because this was occurring during COVID. So very much during the lockdown in Sydney, because disrupted environments are really great for scammers. Everyone in the finance team was working remotely. So they were off balance using new systems and processes. They were using collaboration software that they hadn't really had to rely on before. And because they were all isolated and working from home offices, they couldn't just turn around in their chairs and say, hey, Jerry, why are you sending me this weird email? I'm pretty sure that the Australian Taxation Office didn't change their banking details. In this instance, the fraudster pushed it a little too hard. The rest of the team noticed the unusual behavior, and we were called in to help identify how the breach occurred, secure the perimeter, and find the compromised accounts. So, Dave, I think you wanted to talk here about the role of individuals in identifying these kinds of threats.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah. So again, one of the things we talked about earlier was people, process, and technology. And what you have here is a lot of things about technology. Now, if we were to look at the people aspect, there's a number of indicators that we would maybe wish to look at. So previously, the company that we looked at, they've been proactive. They'd established plans for the data breach response. That the processes were in place. They'd lined up the expert support whenever the crisis hit. They practiced, they trained their staff to recognize issues. They practiced for data breaches. Although there's still maybe a bit more room for improvement in terms of being able to spot some of those phishing attacks. And they needed some work on the protection aspect. So whenever the incident occurred, they've been upgrading to things like multi-factor authentication, and that really helps, certainly with ransomware in this sort of attack. It's a really, really powerful capability. Now, when we talked about people, process, and technology, what we're going to do is look at those again in terms of, well, how can I use each of those to identify? And Tim's going to chat about that in a second. But one of the things that maybe pops out of this for me is about leadership. And often you don't think an awful lot about the leadership role in cybersecurity. But whenever we're talking about the insider threat, understanding behavior and understanding people is really important. And so all of a sudden, that connection with the workforce, being able to understand what's normal and understand what's abnormal, becomes really quite important. Tim, would it be okay if we just went through some of the key indicators then that you've experienced in?
Sure. It gets a bit difficult talking about behavioral warning signs because behavioral warning signs can indicate a number of different things. Low morale doesn't automatically mean that everyone's going to become an insider threat. And while we have seen insider threats evolve a bit over the last year and a half or so, just because everybody's under stress and feeling bad due to COVID doesn't mean that suddenly all of your staff are your enemies. But if you are in a position where your staff have low morale, they are very unhappy, then you are there is an increased risk that they are going to be motivated by revenge. They're going to say, this company's done me wrong, I'm feeling pretty bad about it, I want to make them hurt too. So one of the scenarios in which I've seen insider threats increase is where large corporates are going through rolling redundancies. In a period of restructuring, a lot of people are being exited from the company. Some of those people tend to know things, especially when a few years ago I was working with a bank, and that bank had a number of crisis level responses that they'd had to go through due to data breaches that hadn't hit the public consciousness. A couple of years later, they went through a large-scale redundancy in their security group, and several of those people decided that they would just make a call to the media and say, hey, by the way, there was this massive data breach that the institution managed to hush up a couple of years ago. That doesn't seem right, does it? And that caused a few weeks of adverse media attention for that particular bank. No data was exfiltrated, no documents were stolen. All it took was a little bit of insider knowledge and a phone call, and that kicked off a sequence of events that led to a secondary crisis. I've also seen these kinds of threats emerge where there is staff opposition to corporate activities or to policies. So this is more of a whistleblower situation. Technically, according to our classification schema, they would be rogues, but their motivation is different. They're not looking for money. They're not looking for vengeance. What they're looking for is ethical behavior, and they're not seeing that within the company. So you might have, say, a chief medical officer of an insurance company deciding to go to the media because he feels the policies of that insurance company are unethical. There was a case in Australia a few years ago where one of the major life insurers, their chief medical officer, discovered that the conditions for getting a payout for a heart attack were impossible to satisfy. The only way to get a payout for permanent disability was to die, which meant that you wouldn't be eligible for the permanent disability payment. He tried to raise that within the company. He was dissatisfied with the response, so he went to the media, even though he knew it would cost him his job. So with those two criteria, we could start to see that there may be other indicators. So just ongoing expressions of disgruntlement or discussions of possible new opportunities or threats to leave. Then there are indicators of actual specific intent or specific action, like attempts to bypass security, or suddenly an employee is spending a lot of time in the office after hours or logging onto a system late at night or on the weekend when that is unusual for them. And those tend to be violations of corporate policies as well, but you might see them trying to access files that they're not entitled to, or rifling through the drawers of somebody else's offices. I'm trying to stay away from the digital ones because we're about to move into those next. So beyond just the behavioral stuff, where we often find ourselves turning to is the digital indicators, because there are a lot of systems that can be put into place to help us as investigators and help us as cybersecurity consultants to identify or prevent unauthorized access to sensitive data. So the digital corollary to rifling through somebody's desk is trying to access or search for data in a system that they're not actually, that they're not entitled to or they don't need for their work. If you have a system that is configured in such a way to alert for this kind of thing, Dave did mention a system before that, say you have a customer system and somebody tries to look up the Prime Minister, that might trigger an alert. There tend to be limitations to these kinds of systems. For example, another financial services institution I worked with, they had a system set up whereby they had a class of customer known as the politically exposed person. And these people were either high net worth individuals or politicians or celebrities in one way or another. They tended to have personal account managers. So if somebody tried to access their account, that account manager would get an email alerting them to that access, and they could take steps. But just the general run-of-the-mill customer didn't have a personal account manager, and so that particular protection didn't work for them. Eventually, they had to upgrade the system to create more fine-grained access controls so that only people who needed access to those profiles could get access. But then we might see people accessing data that is outside of their usual routine. So certain jobs, certain positions might only need access to 2 or 3 systems. If they have access to other systems but don't need it, then it could be suspicious or could be a red flag if they just start trawling through these other systems or start downloading data from those systems, which tend to be either centrally based or based in the cloud, to their personal desktop. There doesn't generally need to be a need for that, so that starts to be a suspicious behavior if you start to see a single employee downloading gigabytes of data to their own system, where it's much easier for them to just move it onto a portable storage drive. You might see multiple requests for accesses to resources that they don't need or to files that they don't need. You might see an uptick in the use of unauthorized storage devices like USB drives. So a lot of companies these days are starting to disable USB drives on their systems, instead requiring employees to use things like cloud-based file transfer systems. That's because those centralized systems are much easier to regulate, whereas once something's on a memory stick, it is to all intents and purposes completely invisible to you from an investigatory perspective. Finally, it is low-tech and it's basic, but we often find a lot of people just trying to exfiltrate data by emailing it from their corporate email address to their personal email address. Very often their personal email address is just literally their name at gmail.com. So it's very easy to link to them. Even though it is trivial to set up a throwaway Gmail account or to use any number of other methods, it is tried and tested and it is true. And even in this sophisticated day and age, as insiders become more and more creative with their exfiltration techniques, this one and the USB stick continue to be extremely common exfiltration methods. So sometimes it is as simple as saying, look, we can see that you emailed hundreds of files to yourself over the last week to your personal Gmail account. Yes, the one you registered with HR, so we know it's yours. I think we've got you. But that doesn't mean that just because it's simple, it doesn't work. In many cases, if your data loss prevention system isn't configured correctly or isn't configured in such a way to catch these kinds of exfiltration techniques, basic though they are, they can work. So I have seen companies with extremely expensive data loss prevention systems that were implemented over a 2-year plan, and they forgot to tell someone to actually monitor the alerts. So by the time somebody actually got around to reading it, the person had already walked out the door with a memory stick with gigabytes of data that they'd just downloaded through their legitimate access. And then it became a far more complex procedure to try and recover that from them, because you're relying on NDAs, but you have no leverage. They've already left the company. In some cases, they've been gone for days, weeks, months before the alert's even uncovered. So unless somebody's actually looking at it, unless somebody's reading the alerts, unless that person knows what to do with the alerts, the most sophisticated system won't save you. You need to actually train your people as well as implement your system. And it goes back to what Dave was saying about people and process and what was the third one, Dave? I've completely forgotten your.
Might have been technology.
Thank you. People, process, and technology. I was sure it was another P. In any case, I think that's all I've got on warning signs, and we could probably usefully move on to the differences in how we respond to internal threats as opposed to external threats.
Thanks, Tim. One of the things that really popped out for me there is when we talk about people, process, and technology, another key theme about cybersecurity for us is it's not IT's problem. Whenever you look at something like this is an organizational issue. And whenever, especially, you're looking at people and processes, often they sit outside of IT. So this is not just for your IT and your security teams to worry about. This is an organizational risk. Now,
absolutely. And this is why I'm constantly yelling at people that multidisciplinary problems require multidisciplinary solutions. Your data breach response is not going to just be IT. IT is a core part of it, but you're also going to need to involve your risk and compliance staff and your legal staff. You may need to involve more of the people from the frontline business unit, because they're the ones who understand who needed access. They're the ones who understand the system, and they're the ones who are most familiar with the risk. Ultimately, if you try to do this only as an IT project, only as an IT response, you are going to limit the opportunities you have to minimize your risk.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And we'll no doubt come back to that. And I think whenever we look at Rosemary's section in particular, you'll see that this is not just an IT thing. And really the legal counsel and the implications from general counsel within a firm, it's really key. So let's look at the threat response and internal versus external threats. Slide, please. Now, whenever we look at external threats, it can involve sophisticated, skilled hackers, that can find network vulnerabilities, they can socially manipulate insiders, using something like social engineering. But often we see them as very opportunistic. We regularly see threat actors act in a very transactional manner. They want to make money as quickly, as easily as they possibly can, and then move on to their next target. Business email compromise, ransomware, they're great ways of doing this for the threat actor. They work. We can see them every day that they're working. And one of the key reasons for that is the risk-reward balance is so skewed in their favor. Whenever we look at the insider side of things, internal threats work inside the organization and therefore deliberately and intentionally bypass the exterior defenses. As trusted members of the company, they have far more access than any external threat. Those who facilitate access to networks by falling for phishing or social engineering or being exploited by COVID-19 theme campaigns, such as offering early vaccinations, as we discussed earlier. Existing training and detection programs are often outdated and fail to keep pace with the latest threats. And another element that we see regularly is that attackers are actively recruiting insiders on the dark web. Data sets, privileged company information, user credentials, all value to nefarious cyber actors due to numerous access points via platforms, apps. Sensitive information is ever more accessible. Capitalizing on this remote working, the pandemic, and this move to digitization, cyber threat actors have launched newly targeted attacks focused on employees, individual employees, outpacing those sort of current defense mechanisms. As we sort of alluded to earlier, that sort of data risk is substantially greater for an insider. They already know what the most sensitive information is and exactly where it's held. And you can imagine the amount of time that an external actor would need in order to generate that knowledge. What we've therefore seen is that data exfiltration by an external threat can involve huge troves of information, yet potentially more catastrophic is the risk of small amounts of the most sensitive information being removed by an insider, either intentionally or indeed unintentionally. I'm going to go through the impact of COVID-19 in a little bit more detail.
We can't deny that COVID has substantially changed the way that we work. And that's relevant to us because as the work environment changes, the risk landscape also changes. So in 2020, we went from about 27% of people in the UK working from home sometimes to about 50% working from home most of the time, virtually overnight. And while that number has been declining this year, it still remains quite high. And that's created a radically different risk landscape for us. So firstly, there's a combination of disruption and this influx of new technologies, collaboration software like Zoom and Teams, various SharePoint solutions. And when people are shoved into new solutions very, very quickly, and when they're concerned about their health and their society, people are stressed, they're thrown out of their routines, they haven't been trained on this new technology, and so they make just email the wrong person out of a moment of inattention or accidentally publish something where they shouldn't. So that's why probably we saw a lot of regulators reporting a massive increase in data breaches attributed to human error in the latter half of 2020 and also in the first 2 quarters of 2021. In Australia, I think it was an 18% increase in human error attributed data breaches. Secondly, we saw a massive increase in BYOD, bring your own device. And that was, again, due to the shift to work from home. A lot of companies, a lot of organizations didn't necessarily have corporate devices for everybody. They didn't have laptops, they didn't have phones for each of their employees. And so as they pushed everyone into work from home, they had to allow those employees to use their own technology to do the work. In our digital forensics practice and in our cyber practice, we often see BYOD arrangements play a major role in IP theft investigations. A good example of this is iPhones. A lot of companies will hand you an iPhone and say, look, just create your own Apple ID and set it up. That's great. You might use your existing Apple ID if you already have an iPhone. But that allows you to get another Apple device, sync to your Apple ID, and move information up into the cloud and then back down onto your personal device. So we've seen a number of IP theft investigations which have been just that. The person had a corporate issued device, they had their personal Apple ID on it, they left the company, handed back the phone, went out, bought a new Apple iPhone, put their Apple ID on it, and just brought their iCloud back down onto their phone, synced it, and had all the corporate information that they weren't supposed to take with them. Thirdly, ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes to security, convenience trumps everything else. So if you have a security process or technology process and that process is inconvenient, then staff will find a way around it. So if your VPN is slow because you haven't provisioned it to take on an extra 20,000 people suddenly working from home, then instead of getting the files they need from the centralized database, from the approved data storage location, people will download that to their desktop because they can't stand the server lag. And that puts those files at increasing risk. They could just move them from their desktop onto a USB stick. We've seen COVID contribute to a number of problematic security behaviors just because the solutions that were put in place, because they were jerry-rigged in very little time and using solutions that weren't ideal, were just too inconvenient for staff to deal with long term. Ultimately, these behaviors won't just vanish because the vaccine has been 100% distributed, because things aren't going to go back to the way things were before COVID. We've seen that already. People are saying work from home is here to stay. Hybrid working is the way of the future. Companies are going to reduce their office sizes and reduce the number of desks they have. So we're going to have to get used to all of the changes in the work environment and the risk environment. Ultimately, one thing that we've learned from COVID is that people crave flexibility. So some of the surveys that we've seen have up to 86% of participants saying they want to keep working from home at least 2 or 3 days a week into the future. And so companies will have to respond to that. One of the things we did observe last year is that when faced with a public health problem, what a lot of organizations did was look for technology solutions. And so this included things like video conferencing, which we are all now extremely familiar with, and which we are enjoying the benefits of today. But we saw things like solutions like Zoom go from 10 million active users to 300 million active users in mere months. But beyond that, we also saw trends like thermal imaging cameras. People were installing these in their offices to check whether people had fevers before they came into the building, fevers being, at least at the time, thought to be an indicator of COVID. Always on video cameras for people working from home to try and assess whether they were actually doing their work, whether they were at their desks. Or in some cases, with device recognition to see if people were trying to hold up phones or other devices to take photographs of the screen, or to see if there were other people in the background trying to ensure that unauthorized people weren't seeing sensitive information on monitors. We also saw things like a massive increase in workplace analytics as companies sought to find ways to assess whether people were still being productive while they're working from home. So things like, well, how many emails is this person sending a day or an hour, or how many meetings are they participating in? Now, these aren't necessarily accurate indicators of whether someone's being problematic, but ultimately, when people try to use technology solutions for this kind of problem, they look to what they can measure. And these were the easy things to measure. A lot of larger CBD buildings started looking at sensors to determine how many people were on floors. So we have to make sure that people are social distancing. That means we can only have a maximum of 50 people on this floor. Let's embed sensors in the ceiling so that we can tell how many people have come onto the floor, how many people have left. I saw some companies try to create a COVID contact tracing mechanism themselves using sensors that they would attach to people's swipe cards. So that would detect who you had been within 1.5 meters of and for how long. So this all happened very, very quickly. Things like supplier assessments or governance arrangements, these got deprioritized or they got just forgotten entirely. So what this means is that we have very likely a lot of companies running around with unassessed suppliers, unassessed technology solutions, and as a result, they're carrying a lot of risk. They've collected a lot of data that they don't have a clear plan of what they're going to do with it, and they've got all of these suppliers that they've brought on very quickly, some of which are startups, some of which they don't know how much data the supplier is holding. They don't necessarily have good data governance arrangements in place, and there are no limitations on what the suppliers can do. So what we're now seeing clients having to do is go through the process of dealing with those legacy issues. What data have they collected? Did they collect that data lawfully? What do they need to keep right now? What kind of governance arrangements do they need to put in place with their suppliers? Do they need to start asking for destruction certificates? Or do they need to start doing some sort of contract management arrangements to make sure that the suppliers are not holding personal information about their employees that they don't need to retain? We're starting to now work through a lot of those issues. This is just a metaphor that we've created around the way that we've changed our data environment. Just the idea of the corporate environment as a safe ocean rock pool. It's protected by big stone walls, and the water there is shallow and clear and predictable and understood, but it is surrounded by a deep, dark ocean. So the corporate rock pool in this is centralized servers, where all the data is centralized and we know where it is and is protected by big, thick walls. COVID has forced all of that data out into the ocean. We've moved it out onto a network of devices, some of which the corporate owns and some of which are owned by employees. It's intermediated with cloud solutions and collaboration solutions. But ultimately, that's changed the risk matrix for us. The risk calculus is now far more diverse and distributed, and we're going to have to continue to deal with that for a few years. Next, we're going to talk about information governance. In the circle of, say, cyber risk and information risk and privacy risk, there's a lot of overlap. But beyond just securing the perimeter, information governance is more about understanding what is within your walls. So we started 2020 with a long-standing weakness that made us a lot more vulnerable to the disruption that COVID caused, and that's the increasing creation and collection of data. So we've known for a long time that governments and companies have just been massively increasing the amount of data they collect, and that's largely because storage is cheap. But In the medium and the long term, that causes a lot of problems because while storage is cheap, it's not free. So with enough volume, organizations may end up spending millions of pounds, euros, dollars, whatever your currency of choice is, to hold data that they don't need and they can't actually use. So in our information governance practice globally, we spend a lot of time helping clients convince their executives and their boards that it's worth spending some money right now to understand what data they need and reduce and minimize the data they hold so they can save a lot more money over the next few years and in the long term. Beyond just the cash factor, over time, this hoard of data will just start to get in the way. So in our e-discovery matters, we routinely come across hundreds of thousands or millions of documents that the client didn't expect to find and does not need. Beyond having to spend a lot of time and energy eliminating them from the discovery process, it can actually expose them to more risk in discovery when documents that they would not actually have needed to keep prior to the litigation then become discoverable and are leveraged by the other side. Finally, the more data you have, the more data you have to protect. The growing amount of data increases the risk service. And at the end of the day, it becomes an expensive and pointless proposition to build a fortress around data that delivers no value to you. Regulators are fond of saying that data minimization is in and of itself a security measure. I like this slide just because it very succinctly conveys the problem here. Data is valuable. You can get a lot of value out of exploiting your data appropriately. But for data to actually give you value, it has to be relevant. And the half-life of data relevancy is very short. So you hold on to your data, the risk increases because we have a highly involving set of regulators that are creating higher and higher regulatory obligations. And the data, the longer you hold the data, the less relevant it becomes to you. But the risk doesn't go away. In fact, the risk increases. So over time, what you have is increasing expense, increasing risk, and decreasing utility. And that just ends up being a bad proposition for anybody. So why information governance? Basically, it comes down to two factors. You can't lose what you don't have. Minimization is in of itself a security measure. So you need to do some work to identify what you need, identify what you don't need, and dispose of that data safely. And that allows you to minimize your risks and minimize your costs. Secondly, you can't protect what you don't know you have. For many of our clients, they have huge stores of data. They know there's value in there. They want to leverage it, but ultimately, they actually don't have a great idea of what's in there. So a lot of the work that we end up doing with them is identifying critical data stores. What's sensitive, what's confidential, what's the critical IP, where are the crown jewels, so to speak. And that allows them to not only exploit that data, but it allows them to more effectively protect it. Because at the end of the day, you have to know where it is so you can build nice thick walls around it. So you can have access controls, so you can configure your data loss prevention systems appropriately. Now, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Rosemary, who's going to talk about how we manage insider threats while also preserving privacy.
So while our focus today has been mainly on insider threats, the bottom line is it really doesn't matter where the data loss originates from, whether it's an external attacker stealing or that employee that's acting carelessly or maliciously. Critical data should be protected no matter who has access to it. So let me expand a little bit on Dave and Tim's point on the people, process, and technology. Effective privacy management is all about a combination of good governance as well as effective tools and technologies. So what does this mean? You want to complement your technical solutions with privacy protections that target your employees, contractors, and service providers, basically anyone that has that rightful access to your data. You want to give consideration to striking that right balance between mitigating the risks that Dave and Tim talked about and reducing costs while still deriving value and strategic insight from all that data that you collect. By working towards compliant data practices and a holistic data governance, the right balance can be achieved, but we all know that definitely takes a lot of work. And implementing data privacy protection controls is very important to all companies. Like Tim said, and I agree with, I like to consider privacy as a value add. To that end, company policies and controls for creating and maintaining rules for handling personal data based on data protection laws and regulations and best practices is a must-have. And then you need to add to that the importance of building in accountability at all levels and then demonstrating strong compliance. So of course, now you're thinking, wow, this is so much easier said than done. How do you address this new reality? First, you want to start with maintaining a really robust privacy program led and supported by executive leadership that has oversight by your board. Your privacy program or insider threat program, whatever you want to call it, should be grounded in a company-wide governance structure that enables the effective management of your privacy risks, incorporates your privacy controls into your systems and products to safeguard information. So if you're familiar with privacy by design, that's what this is. Train your employees, this is really important, and business partners to understand how their actions can introduce privacy risk and refresh those training programs. Include the deployment of monitoring and response capabilities to address the situation in the event of the insider external threat or attack. And this is really your data breach incident response procedures. Make sure that program remains current and relevant. It's really difficult when you have other priorities to make sure that you maintain an updated program, but you want to make sure that you do. And that this program should be reviewed and revised to address changes in the risk landscape. And most importantly, have appropriate executive leadership in place that's going to monitor that implementation and monitor compliance. So taking a look at emerging data protection laws and regulations, the regulatory landscape is not one to ignore, as it will continue to drive your privacy strategy. The past few years were extremely busy on the data privacy and data protection front with a wave of global privacy changes. Some worth noting include changing in cross-border data transfers between the US, UK, Europe, and the rest of the world, laws and regulations around the protection of children's data, targeting advertising and obtaining consent, responding to data subject requests, requirements for consent mechanisms, whether that's implied versus express, and that varies based on the jurisdiction in which you operate in, privacy and legal requirements to support employee monitoring, which I'll talk about in a second, upholding data subject rights and fielding increasing matters related to the privacy right or actions for data breaches, extremely important to pay attention to. And then of course, the never ending new and emerging data protection laws that we're being faced with. So let's talk a little bit about transparency privacy practices. While it's good business practice to have these policies in place, you want to make sure that your policies align with your actual operational practices. And I've seen this all too often where privacy policies, both internal and notices, don't align to actually what's happening at your organization. You want to make sure that your employees are aware of this practice. Being transparent and providing clarity to your employees regarding your data privacy policies should be considered your standard practice. Make employees aware, hold them accountable. While this may not stop all your insider threats, it definitely puts your employees on warning. Now, how do you do this? Because this gets really complicated. When building your disclosures, you really want to pay attention to the specific data protection requirements for the appropriate jurisdictions in which you operate, because they vary tremendously. These notices should be written in clear and plain English and should be easily accessible by all your employees. So let me just give you a few examples. Employee notices. Your employee notices should provide reasonable security measures and monitoring. This can be through your email communications, formal training, banners presented upon login into your network, privacy policy monitoring language, and data transfer agreements. Really important is your acceptable use policy, and this touches on Tim's comment about bring your own devices. These policies should be available to employees upon new hire and as they change, and they should clearly define how the company restricts the ways in which your company networks, systems, company devices, or personal devices access company data and how that data may be used. You want to pay attention to setting uniform guidelines as to how these may be used so that there's no ambiguities. And then you want to train your employees on these policies. Data privacy notices should be aligned with your operational practices. And if you monitor or use surveillance systems, you want to make sure those disclosures regarding those practices include the means of effective enforcement of individual privacy rights. And of course, it always comes down to data proportionality and integrity. Data must only be used as necessary to perform the authorized business function, and delete that data when it's no longer in use. So to enhance Tim's comment, this is where data minimization comes in to reduce your risk. This also applies if you're collecting data from monitoring and surveillance systems.
Rosemary, could I jump in there for a second?
Absolutely.
We talked, just on that point, we talked a little bit before about the different kinds of surveillance systems that some companies put in during COVID and are continuing to put in as they try to deal with the insider threat issue. And I think what you're talking about here in terms of how we talk to our staff about what kind of surveillance we're doing, what kind of data we're collecting about them as they go through their jobs is really relevant. Because if unhappy employees are a bigger insider threat, this is part of how we keep them happy. We make sure that our surveillance systems are proportionate and don't feel intrusive or creepy. We make sure that they're well understood and transparent. Because ultimately, happy employees, satisfied employees are a defense against insider threats, and employees who are sad or angry or feel unduly surveilled are more likely to be a threat. And so what you're talking about here about transparency and how we treat employees with respect becomes a big part of how we reduce the threat.
Okay, so a big thing is, now that I've talked about your governance program, is how can you protect the data if you don't know where it is? Really, really important, very hard to do, but you have to put a focus on it. The biggest challenge in all this is probably actually finding where your data resides and making sure that you put those controls in place to protect that data, and then destroy the data if there's no longer a legitimate reason for keeping it to reduce overall risk. We had an experience in a company that I worked with where we had an unexpected data breach because we had files that had been sitting on a server for 15 years that nobody knew were out there. You want to make sure that those are no longer available. So a good way to do this is data mapping. So I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with data mapping, so let me just give a real quick refresher. Data mapping is the process of taking an inventory of what you collect, how it's used, where it's stored, and how it flows through your organization. Basically, providing your companies and your legal privacy and security teams with much needed direction. A data map is crucial to identify your corporate risk. Every department should be considered during the process, especially marketing, human resource, IT, and legal. It's critical to ensure that these maps are accurate and they remain updated. So you probably want to have a change management process in place as new tools, technologies, and processes come on board to update those maps. Little background on some of the data mapping is many regulations require ongoing data maps to accommodate privacy standards. These are not only essential foundations of your privacy program, but it's also mandated under the articles of GDPR. Implementing a successful DSAR program, which is a data subject rights program, includes creating and maintaining a complete inventory and map of all the personal data so that you could track it back to that data subject so you can respond to their request. For contract analysis and third-party risk data, mapping is extremely helpful to identify those contracts that need to be reviewed and updated with new regulatory compliant data protection clauses, as well as executing data protection impact assessments. So let me switch gears a little bit. And Tim, Ian, and Dave brought this up, and I'm going to emphasize it again. Your employees are your first line of defense. So regular and proper training remains an important program and component of your data compliance initiatives. Each employee has a critical role to play in protecting the company and their most sensitive data. So how do you do this? To promote the education and awareness of your workforce, develop and update, particularly during COVID, and refresh proactive privacy awareness programs with frequent communications to employees to drive home specific requirements. This could be advising them on who's responsible for the overall privacy program in case they have any questions, identifying and training employees on new and emerging privacy risks and the impacts it could have on the organization, particularly phishing or COVID, working from home, and establishing hotlines and emails for employees to report incidents should they come across them. Make sure that your employees are trained. So provide relevant privacy training to all your employees, and particularly specific training for those responsible for managing personal data. You want to do that at hire, annually, or as the business requires, and put in metrics to make sure that that training is actually taking place. Address and communicate that inappropriate behavior will be followed by an adequate response, whether that's punitive actions or additional educational programs. And this is where your HR and legal teams play a critical role in your strategy and should be actively engaged. So let me switch a little bit over to the continuously monitoring behaviors. A critical step to address insider threats is to learn what's normal behavior and what isn't. The way to accomplish that is to deploy the activity monitoring and analytical tools that the team has already talked about. However, pay attention, there's a balance to strike between lawfully monitoring and the employee's right to privacy. So if you're going to do this, you want to be mindful as jurisdictional requirements. Make sure that the monitoring that you're going to do is proportionate to your corporate culture, is for a legitimate interest, and doesn't interfere with the employee's fundamental right to privacy. Make sure the employees are notified in advance through a clear monitoring policy and that they're educated on that policy. Make sure that consent is obtained where it's required and data protection rights are respected. And to the point that Tim raised, make sure you are not collecting too much data that's going to run you amok with privacy laws in the future. So just to wrap up real quick, insider risk detection is challenging and all of us can be impacted. The best way for advanced preparation is through documented policies that align with your information security tools and technologies and privacy regulations. That's always the best route to take. Make sure that you have executive leadership support that's not only funding your program, but reporting the risk up to the board and supporting you with resources and tools. Continually measure your progress and success of your program through metrics, policy compliance assessments to make sure that you're mitigating risk while maintaining compliance to privacy laws and regulations. Back to you, Dave.
Thanks, Rosemary. And that sort of last point about not only having the design effectiveness in place, having the right things, the processes, the technology, and so on, but checking that it's being implemented effectively, the operational effectiveness, so important. So thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time today. We've talked about some of the data risk challenges and the issues that our clients are facing as a result of disruption of 2020 and the post-COVID environment. We've talked about the increased data holdings. We've talked about the evolving regulatory environment with increasingly empowered regulators. And we might get into that in some of the questions. And we've talked about the work environment and how that's undergone a very rapid transformation. So what we'd like to do is to leave you with some key points for managing that data risk. Be proactive. Invest in your policy framework. Make sure you know how to manage data risk effectively. Work to understand and minimize your data. Protect yourself. Make sure you have the systems in place to keep your data safe. Things like data loss prevention capabilities. Minimize your points of exposure. And lastly, practice. Run simulations. Make sure the first time that you're not facing this is in a crisis itself, that you've gone through those, you know who to speak to, and you know internally who each person needs to speak to as an incident unfolds. And finally, Tim mentioned this earlier, nothing's simple in a network world. Therefore, multifaceted problems need multidisciplinary solutions. Slide, please. Now, one of the things that we find useful and our clients tend to find useful is, well, as a board or as as a senior member within a company, what are the right sort of questions that we should be asking to understand our own exposure at the moment? And we'd like to leave you with the following. So has your board discussed this particular risk? Is the insider threat within your overall risk management system, or is it separated in some form of IT management, risk management system? Who owns it? Are the HR and security departments investing in managing the risks from employees? Somebody who could become an insider threat. A really great example, and Rosemary talked about this, is things like joiners, movers, and leavers. It's a really important process that involves a really close interaction between both HR and IT and security. And finally, who would lead a response to an insider incident, and who would you call on to assist? So thank you very much indeed for your time today, and we'll hand back to Robert.
Thank you, Dave, for that hand back. So before we turn to the question and answer session, thank you to Dave, Ian, Tim, and Rosemary for their presentations this morning. Really interesting, lots of points to think about there for everybody, and actually really difficult to identify a few takeaways there that people can do with as they follow on their day. So I'll come back to that, I think, probably at the end of the Q&A. You touched on, a number of you touched on how this whole area has changed during COVID. In fact, our whole life have changed during COVID, but with employees working from home and the movement of data that's involved with that, you touched upon the risks that brings. The world will never get back to how it used to be, and I'm sure we will eventually start thinking of a post-COVID world. But how do you see the situation developing over the next 12, 18 months as we start to move either into a world where we're in the new norm with COVID, or COVID does actually start to retrench and maybe even disappear altogether, we can but hope. How do you see the short-term risks in that sort of hybrid working environment? And how do you see the longer-term risks developing? Anybody, any thoughts?
I can say something on that. So one of the things that I think we've already mentioned, but really shouldn't be underestimated, is the impact of the expansion of use of personal devices, bring your own devices, because these devices are outside of the protective framework of the company systems in many cases. Now, that doesn't have to be the case. There are, for example, ways where the company can reach into some degree to enforce certain standards, for example, with mobile phones. But if individuals are using their own devices, typically there's less ability to monitor, less ability to deploy threat detection. And also it's harder, if an incident does occur, to then investigate. If an individual, we had the example of an iPhone earlier, to take the example of a Mac computer, it might be that the company's systems, defensive systems, don't apply. They don't work on Macs. Macs have onboard encryption, which means that an individual can set their own encryption. And even if you did get that device to examine should an incident occur, the individual can very easily wipe that device or hand it back with very secure encryption that they're not going to share the credentials of with you. So it's important to assess what it is that you can do and how far your safety net goes, and therefore maybe whether you limit pools of, as was mentioned earlier, the crown jewels. Do you let them be accessed from this type of device? Do you let them be downloaded onto this type of device, given that you have less ability to both monitor, protect, and take action?
Thanks, Ian. Any of our other speakers want to offer any thoughts on the sort of the developing COVID world, or even the post-COVID world, and how that's going to have an impact on security?
Yeah, if I can mention one thing, and I think it's going to lead neatly into something that Tim would be really well placed to talk about, and that's our new, the impact of new information commissioner. So I think whenever Ian talked about things like wearables, that's a really interesting aspect. And we see with life insurance at the moment, the ability to track activity and therefore reduce risk. How that's then impacting in the workplace. Again, as you start to link workplace to insurance premiums and the like, how that comes together. But this really sets up Tim for his next discussion is how we'll see the regulators start to tackle those sorts of aspects in the coming months. I think will be increasingly interesting, and from our perspective, increasingly important to understand that risk in real detail. Like we said throughout this presentation, it's not an IT thing. This is something that an organization really needs to get their head around. So it's I think for me that's a fascinating area. It's going to be, for some people it's going to be quite daunting, but it's going to be dynamic. It's going to be interesting. Things are going to be changing. So I'm really quite excited about that. Tim, what do you?
I think you touched on a really interesting point there, Dave, about how the ICO starts to address themselves to this changing arena, and it'd be interesting to see what commentary they give us over the weeks and months ahead. And a really good point there actually about the ICO. Tim, anything that you want to add to Ian and Dave's comments?
Yeah, I mean, look, the approach of regulators to what is a pretty volatile environment is a very good question. But even before COVID came and kicked the apple cart over, regulators were already tearing down a path of trying to increase their powers and trying to use those powers more effectively. And frankly, the GDPR is to blame for that. The GDPR upped the bar on data privacy and data protection so much that other jurisdictions have been racing to catch up. And so we've seen a proliferation of mandatory data breach notifications and moves to increase fines and regulatory powers, and then an increase in regulators trying to use those new powers. So what we have is a rapidly evolving regulatory environment, and then increasingly empowered regulators. And the new pick for the head of the ICO, John Edwards, is a really good example of that. John has, for the last few years, been the Privacy Commissioner of New Zealand, and in that role has been increasingly vocal about the need for technology companies, for social media, for big tech to be more responsible in the way that they use their technology, and a very vocal proponent of companies being more sensitive in how they deploy those technologies. And so I think you can anticipate that John, in the much larger role of the head of the ICO and with the much greater powers of the UK GDPR, will be looking to exercise those powers in a particularly forceful way. He has very little patience for thin excuses, and we often see those in the wake of massive privacy, massive security failures. For example, the matter that Rosemary mentioned, where there was a data breach involving 15-year-old data on a server that everybody just forgot about. Those kinds of oversights won't fly very well, and they haven't flown very well with the ICO to date anyway. So it's not that this is going to be a new paradigm. It's just that you're going to be blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, with a particularly energetic and forceful regulator.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting appointment, actually, appointing John as the new ICO and lead. I thought it shows that GDPR has got an increasing international flavour to it. But Tim, you touched there on technology, which brings me to one of the questions I was going to ask later. Albeit you touched about perhaps the outlook side of it, the output side in terms of Facebook and Twitter, etc. But there is an argument to say that all of these problems that we've talked about today are all technology created, that they all come about as a result of technology. Should there be an obligation on the technology to solve the problems? And is it even possible for technology to solve the problems? And are you seeing any signs at this stage of technology companies taking ownership of this challenge and this problem and actually trying to apply themselves to sorting it out? Any comments on that from anybody?
It's a really good question. Oh, sorry.
Go on, Tim.
Can I start?
Yeah, of course, Tim. Yeah, of course.
It's a really great question. So it's a really great question, but ultimately technology is a tool and tools are value neutral. You can use a hammer to bash in someone's head or you can use it to build a house. So the question of whether technology can solve the problem for us, technology is a tool that we can use to help solve the problem. But it comes back to Dave's mantra of people, process, and technology. Technology alone won't do it. You still need to have the people, they still need to be trained. You still need to have the processes. Those need to be properly designed to enable the people to use the technology to solve the problem. And the knee bone is connected to the thigh bone and so on and so on. It will never be a single technology solution, and anybody trying to solve the problem with only technology is doomed to fail. It has to be part of a holistic solution.
But Tim, I like your point there about technology, but when I started in practice as a solicitor all those years ago, we had filing cabinets, and filing cabinets evolved to have locks on, and then filing cabinets with locks on evolved to become even more sophisticated safe rooms with locks on, and that of course in the day of us all storing paper, and the storeroom providers, whether it's the filing cabinets or the strong room providers, all provided some sort of security mechanism to stop people getting information out they weren't entitled to. As a lowly trainee solicitor, I wouldn't be expected to have a key to even the filing cabinet, let alone a strong room. So the technology there, in a very basic way, kind of evolved. Isn't it incumbent upon the technology providers today to actually provide some of these sort of security mechanisms?
Can I take that one? I think.
Yeah, of course, Dave.
Yeah, Robert, one of the things that you talked about there, the thing that really resonates for me was the appropriate level of protection, cognizant of the particular threat. So you started off with file cabinets. There was some event where somebody came in and removed something, let's say. So all of a sudden we started to add locks to them, and we as the threat evolved, we evolved what we consider was appropriate in terms of the protections that went around that. And we see the exact same in terms of cybersecurity and data privacy. We see things like sentiment analysis tools, understanding what's in social media and understanding how people are feeling or who they might vote for. And you get into some really interesting privacy discussions and analysis about those. Like, could that be used to understand an insider threat? I think you're really stepping on the edge of, certainly with a new information commissioner, new head of ICO, that could be really challenging. But what is appropriate? What is appropriate for your organization? And when Tim was talking about making sure that technology is not creepy or intrusive, the sort of mechanisms that you need to apply. For me, you're trying to get something that is appropriate for the level of organization, is appropriate for users, what they consider important to themselves, and then is appropriate in terms of what the regulator thinks is reasonable, appropriate and reasonable in order to protect the data. So encryption in transit, and all those good things as well. So is there an impact on the technology providers? Yes, and we're seeing some of the big ones coming out with data loss prevention tools as part of their built-in capability. However, at the same time, we see companies use hybrid environments. So they're not just using one provider, and therefore things start to get a bit more awkward. There's always that complexity there.
Thanks, Dave. I'm conscious that our overall time is moving on, and I am always keen as chair to make sure these things, to use my plain analogy, touch down and land at the overall time limit. So moving on to another question I've got. And it was interesting listening to the stuff about employees and how to manage and lead your employees through these areas. Surely there's a dividing line, isn't there, between monitoring the employees' threats and what's appropriate there. These are they actually compromising the employee's own privacy, which they're entitled to. Now, I know there's some ICO guidance around that, and my fellow employment lawyers will all have views on that. But from your perspective as technology specialists, what's your sense of where that line is, and how should people listening today judge that line themselves in their own businesses? Because of course, it's shades of grey for every business, isn't it? It's completely different for everybody calls it differently. But what advice would you be giving to people listening today around that issue?
Again. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we keep trying to divide our work stream from our personal stream. So ideally, you come to work, you log onto your work computer, and you only do work, and then you go home and you log onto your own computer or your own phone and you do your personal things. But we know just from living in the world that that's not how people operate. People are going to come to work, they're going to log onto the internet banking and pay their bills in a 10-minute break, and then they're going to go back to work, or they're going to check Facebook for 5 minutes and see a picture of someone's baby. And we're going to keep running into these overlaps between the work sphere and the personal sphere. And the increase in BYOD just makes that more and more complex. What we can do is come up with ways where we can create an artificial divide. So what we're seeing a lot of in the BYOD space is solutions where, for example, you can create a partition on the phone and all the work data goes in that partition, and there is access through a centralized monitoring solution to that partition. So if the phone is lost, we can delete that partition. Or probably more commonly, you have your personal phone, but you can access your work email on it. But that's coming from a cloud environment. So if the person leaves the institution or if the phone is lost, we can just delete that access, and whoever has the phone won't be able to access the work email, but will still be able to use the phone for their personal uses. So we can find ways to create virtual partitions, if not physical ones, and that can help us deliver a better security outcome.
Thanks, Tim. Any further comments? Perhaps Rosemary, have you got any, you were touching on managing internal risks and information governance. Where do you see that line lying between monitoring risk and breaching privacy?
It's a really good question. And I think what we also have to do is kind of trust and value our employee. Look at your corporate culture. For the most part, all your employees want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So what I would suggest is that you also have strong governance and risk management programs that are in place that are monitoring the activities, and then modify your programs as you feel fit. So don't put the lock key on everything right away. Take a look at how your organization is functioning, take a look at what your risks are, then modify your programs to manage to those risks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice there, Rosemary, about almost building out your process and management processes, and not assuming that you've got to have it right on day one. And I think that's actually quite often a point that clients miss. It's important to start somewhere. You've got to start your journey somewhere, and that's as much true here in this field as it is anywhere else that clients are looking. I've got one last question before we move on from that. I'm conscious that time is moving on to make sure we're done within the overall 2-hour slot. Any more comments from Ian or Dave on that question there about the balance between monitoring and privacy?
I think actually just another side to that is if an incident does happen, it does come into the recovery phase as well. So you can have an incident, for example, very simple, somebody who's leaving the company copies some files onto a USB they have, and takes it with them, and that comes to light. And it might be that the company's primary concern there is simply to contain and clear up. They don't necessarily want to seek further action, but they do want to clear up that incident. And there's a certain amount of sensitivity there, because that's a mix of personal and business documents, communications, and so on. Often we find the best way to approach that is collaboration with the individual. Yeah. They will often have their own representation, and it is not difficult to work out a process where there is input from both sides. There's protection of both private and company property, and collaboratively that can be gone through quite smoothly. What we find is if there's too much of an effort to be combative and overly protective, and try and come up with a perfect way that that doesn't accept reality, it makes it more time consuming, more expensive, more hassle for everybody. So I think this principle extends beyond.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting points there, Ian, about not assuming that everybody is hostile, or even if they are hostile, they're completely and totally hostile, and actually that discussion, negotiation, discussion and agreement point there is key, consensus almost. Okay, my last question is one of my favourite questions to ask as chair of events like this. I'm a great believer in the 3-point principle, which is if you're in a meeting, always have 3 takeaways to go in action, or 3 points that you note for future reference. And in these kind of events, I believe, what are the 3 takeaways? What are the 3 lessons to learn? What are the 3 important things? And I'm going to ask each of you in turn what you think the key 3 points should be for our listeners today to take away back to their desks later today or over the week, and to be thinking about from the perspective of the things that you touched on. So Dave, let's start with you, because you were the first speaker. Sorry about that. It was random, honestly. Dave, what would be your 3 takeaways for people today? What do you think are the 3 points that they should be focusing on?
Okay, so we may have mentioned it once or twice. For me, people, process, and technology, they come together. That's my first point. My second point that we talked about before was about this isn't an IT thing. This is an organizational problem that we need an organization to address. And the third point is that I feel that cybersecurity and data privacy, if you try and bolt them on at the end of a process, you're constantly pushing uphill. If you could design it in from the start, you're at such an advantage. If you design for privacy, if you design for security in the same way a builder designs for having gravity, that's what we should be doing. We should be demanding that what we're using is designed for security and for privacy.
I really like those 3 points, Dave. I'm going to slightly reshuffle them in the sense of, I think you make exactly the right point. It's not an IT issue, it's an organisation issue. An organisation is about people, processing and technology, and actually design it at the beginning, don't design it at the end. So 3 really neat takeaways there from you. Thank you, Dave. So you've set the bar really high for the next person. Tim, what are your 3 points for people today?
I would go with number 1, be proactive. It's going to be so much easier if you put in some effort now before a crisis hits and find your data, put in the protections, put in the processes that you need to keep it safe. However, in the technology game, and certainly in the cybersecurity game, nothing is ever 100%. So be ready for when the crisis is going to hit. So the second point is don't let a good crisis go to waste. If you've had a breach, if you've had an incident, use that and leverage it to take the steps that you need to improve your governance, improve your technology, and improve your process. Use that to come out of your crisis stronger. And finally, I'm going to say it for a third time, multidisciplinary problems require multidisciplinary solutions. You're going to need the collaboration of not only your cybersecurity guys, but your risk and compliance guys, your in-house legal, your communications, internal and external, in order to deal with the issues that are created by insider threats and by the breaches that they cause. So a holistic effort is what is going to help improve your chances of preventing a breach and help you get out of one when they occur.
Tim, thank you for those. I like those three. I'm going to describe those as the 3 Ps. I'm going to slightly reshuffle those as people, being proactive, to be prepared. So I think those are really 3 neat, really nice ones to take away. So I think you've upped the ante there on Dave. That's great. That's great. Some great takeaways for you there. Ian, no pressure for you at all. What are your 3 points?
Well, I think we're getting into the realm of the same point in slightly different ways. So let me try and be brief and encapsulate it. So I think it's prepare to prevent, accept that people are people, things will happen. So prepare to respond as well.
Yeah, I think those are 3 really neat, actually. I think that wraps up probably the whole message today, doesn't it, about accepting that things happen and that people have to deal with things that happen, and actually you can try and prepare for things that are going to happen, but ultimately it's the wide ball, the curveball that potentially can catch you out. And hopefully the people who are listening today are part of that cohort of people that do actually understand the issues, understand them more after today, and actually then can be prepared. So thank you. So a different take in many ways, Tim and Dave before Ian. Rosemary, last but not least, finish us off on a great note. What would be your 3 takeaways?
No pressure there, right? So really be transparent in your programs. Work collaboratively ahead of time with your legal, your privacy, IT, information security to put these programs in place. Make sure that your employees are aware of it. Continually adjust those programs and then modify it based on the actions that you're seeing within your organization. And the biggest takeaway is don't have any surprises. Know where your data is and don't collect anything you don't need.
I think some great takeaways there, Rosemary. I think it's amazing as a commercial lawyer how often clients don't understand their data. I think that's one of the things that hasn't perhaps come across today, because we're assuming listeners of a particular interest. I think actually it's quite common to hear that lots of people don't know where their data is, and absolutely great. Continually assessing, and a word that I like to use in all sorts of scenarios, communication. Because actually, if you're not communicating, you can have the greatest plans for the greatest situations. But actually, if you haven't communicated it, you're absolutely going nowhere. So, Rosemary, you've definitely finished off on a high there. Thank you very much for that indeed. Okay, so our panelists will all be relieved to know that I've got no other questions for them, which is great because we'll now be finishing on overall time. It just leaves me to thank Dave, Tim, Ian and Rosemary for their time today. Really appreciated, really interesting presentations. And also then to thank you, the listeners, for your time today in listening to us. Hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you got some good takeaways. And perhaps more importantly, I hope you enjoy the rest of the cyber conference as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.